The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the rolling hills of the Montana countryside. Jacob Jake Sawyer stood on the porch of his modest farmhouse, wiping grease from his hands after fixing his old tractor. The faint sounds of cattle echoed in the distance, and the gentle rustle of the wind in the trees was the only company he kept. Jake's days were simple, filled with hard work and solitude. It was the life he had chosen after leaving behind a world he never spoke about. The townsfolk regarded Jake as a quiet, unassuming man. To them, he was just another farmer in the valley, one of many who had chosen the isolation of the hills over the chaos of modern life. But what they didn't know, what Jake kept locked away in the recesses of his mind, was his past as a Delta Force operator. Years of covert missions, danger, and loss had driven him to seek peace, and for a time, he had found it. As night fell, Jake prepared for bed. His farmhouse, a simple structure with peeling paint and creaking floorboards, reflected the man himself, worn but enduring. He had just settled in when the distant rumble of motorcycles shattered the tranquility. At first, Jake dismissed it as travelers passing through, but the sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The bikes were heading straight for his farm. Stepping outside, Jake saw them. 4 riders, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. The leader, a burly man with a patch reading Riker sewn onto his leather vest, dismounted first. The others followed, their presence as menacing as the growl of their engines. "Evening, old man," Riker sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Nice little setup you got here. Shame if something happened to it." Jake said nothing, his calm demeanor betraying no fear. He simply stood there, arms crossed, as Riker and his crew approached. "We're gonna need a little donation," Riker continued, his grin widening. "You know, to keep this area safe. How about you hand over whatever cash you got? Maybe some of that cattle too." Jake's eyes flickered, a subtle warning that went unnoticed. "You've got the wrong farm," he said evenly. Riker laughed, his crew joining in. "Oh, I don't think so, old man. See, we're gonna take what we want and you're gonna watch." Jake held his ground, his silence unnerving. Finally, Riker waved a hand, signaling his crew to search the property. But before they could move, Jake spoke again. "Leave now. And this ends here," he said, his voice low but firm. Riker froze, his grin fading. There was something in Jake's tone, something cold and commanding. For a moment, he hesitated, but his ego won out. "You're a stubborn one, huh?" Riker growled, stepping closer. "You don't scare me, old man." Jake didn't flinch, his expression unreadable. Finally, Riker scoffed and motioned for his crew to follow him back to their bikes. "We'll be back," he warned. "And when we come, you'll wish you'd been smarter." The roar of their engines faded into the night, leaving Jake alone once more. But the peace was gone, replaced by a storm brewing in his mind. Jake stepped back into his house, locking the door behind him. He moved to a corner of the living room, where he pried up a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a box, weathered, dented, and full of memories he had tried to bury. He opened it, revealing a collection of mementos, a military knife, a folded American flag, and a photograph of his old Delta Force team. Running his fingers over the photo, Jake felt the weight of his past return. He had sworn never to use those skills again, to leave that life behind. But as he stared at the image of his younger self, he realized that the quiet farmer the world knew might not be enough to protect what was his. "I gave you a chance," he muttered to himself, his voice a mix of regret and determination. That night, as the stars glimmered above, Jake began to prepare, not for another day of farming, but for a battle he knew was inevitable. The morning sun painted the Montana hills in golden hues, but Jake's mind was clouded. He walked the perimeter of his property, scanning for signs of tampering. The Outlaws hadn't returned yet, but he knew they would. Their threats weren't idle. Men like Riker didn't back down. They escalated. Jake had seen it before on battlefields far from this quiet farm. By mid-morning, Jake's suspicions were confirmed. Deep tire tracks marred the dirt road leading to his property, and several of his cattle had wandered out through a section of broken fence. He found their tracks easily, but the message was clear. The Outlaws had been here again, testing his patience. Jake repaired the fence with practiced efficiency, his movements calm but purposeful. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to the tools of his trade, both old and new. The hammer in his hand was a reminder of the life he had chosen. The blade tucked discreetly in his boot was a relic of the one he had left behind. For now, he used the hammer. Soon, he might have no choice but to switch. Later that day, the distant growl of engines broke the stillness. Jake looked up from his work, his eyes narrowing. The Outlaws were back, this time with more riders. 8 bikes roared into view, kicking up clouds of dust as they approached. Riker led the pack, his smirk as wide as the Montana sky. "Nice day, isn't it?" Riker called out, dismounting with exaggerated ease. His crew spread out behind him, their leather jackets glinting in the sunlight. Jake straightened, his face impassive. "You're trespassing," he said simply. "Trespassing?" Riker feigned offense, glancing at his crew. "Hear that, boys? The old man's got rules." The men laughed, but the sound was hollow, forced. Jake caught the flicker of unease in some of their eyes. They didn't fear him yet, but they weren't as confident as their leader. "You've got guts," Riker continued, stepping closer. "I'll give you that, but guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered. Here's the deal. You give us what we want, and we'll leave this place standing. Keep playing tough, and—" He trailed off, gesturing toward Jake's barn. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any retort. Annoyed, Riker waved to one of his men. "Go on, show him we're serious." A younger outlaw, eager to prove himself, strode toward the barn. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Not yet. The young man reached the barn door, raising a crowbar to pry it open, when a loud crack split the air. Startled, the outlaw dropped the crowbar, looking down to see his boot caught in a makeshift snare. It wasn't lethal, just enough to send a message. Riker's smirk vanished. "You think this is funny?" he barked. Jake stepped forward, his gaze steady. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. The tension hung thick in the air. For a moment, it seemed Riker might charge, but instead, he nodded to his crew. "Let's go," he growled. But this ain't over. As the bikes roared away, Jake allowed himself a moment of relief. He had won this round, but it was only the beginning. The Outlaws weren't the type to let a slight go unanswered. That evening, Jake sat on his porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the Outlaws would return, and next time they'd come prepared. But so would he. Inside the house, Jake opened the box under the floorboards again. This time, he didn't just look. He unpacked the contents methodically. The knife, the flag, and the old field radio he hadn't touched in years. The tools of his former life felt heavy in his hands, not from their weight, but from what they represented. He set the radio on the table and powered it on. Static crackled to life, filling the room with an eerie hum. Jake adjusted the dials, his movements deliberate. Finally, a voice came through, a voice he hadn't heard in over a decade. "This is Alpha Base. Identify yourself." Jake hesitated, his hand hovering over the transmitter. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. "This is Sawyer. I need intel." The line went silent for a moment before the voice returned, sharper this time. "Sawyer, it's been a while. What's going on?" Jake's jaw tightened. "Trouble," he said simply. "I'll fill you in, but I need eyes on a group called the Iron Fangs. Local outlaws. They're making a mess of things." "Understood. We'll get back to you." As the line went dead, Jake leaned back in his chair. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. The farmer was gone. In his place stood a man ready to fight, not for a mission, but for his home. The next morning dawned crisp and cold, the Montana air biting with the promise of winter. Jake stepped out onto his porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. The quiet was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. He knew the outlaws wouldn't stay away for long, and when they came, they'd come in force. After a quick breakfast, Jake set to work. His years of military training surged to the forefront of his mind, guiding every decision. First, he fortified his property. The traps he'd laid earlier were a start, but now he needed something more substantial. He rigged lines of wire between the fence posts, carefully camouflaging them. Hidden beneath the tall grass, he buried spikes and dug shallow pits that could incapacitate a charging bike. In the barn, Jake unearthed a stash of supplies he kept from his years on the force, gear he never thought he'd use again. He pulled out a compact surveillance drone, its sleek body covered in a layer of dust. After a quick inspection and a fresh set of batteries, the drone hummed to life. Jake launched it into the sky, its tiny camera feeding live footage back to his tablet. He guided it toward the direction the outlaws had retreated the previous night. It didn't take long to find them. About 5 miles out, nestled in a clearing by the river, was their camp. Dozens of bikes were parked in a haphazard line, and a cluster of tents surrounded a central fire pit. Jake zoomed in, identifying several faces, including Riker's scowling profile. The outlaws weren't just planning another visit, they were preparing for war. Jake spent the rest of the day observing their movements. He noted how many men they had, their patterns, and the placement of their vehicles. Riker was clearly in charge, barking orders and rallying his crew. Jake could see they were armed, not just with bats and chains, but with firearms. It was a far cry from the rowdy gang they pretended to be. By late afternoon, Jake had seen enough. He recalled the drone and returned to the house. The weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about defending his farm anymore. The outlaws were a threat to the entire valley, and Jake couldn't let them take control. That night, Jake struck first. He moved under the cover of darkness, his footsteps silent as he approached the outlaws' camp. He wasn't here for a fight. Not yet. Instead, he focused on sabotage. Using a pair of wire cutters, he slipped past the perimeter and disabled the ignition systems on several bikes. He poured sugar into gas tanks and slashed tires, ensuring that when the outlaws tried to move, they'd be grounded. As he worked, Jake couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation. Riker was boasting loudly about their plans to raid the farm at dawn, followed by a sweep of the nearby town. The outlaws' arrogance was their weakness. They thought they were invincible. Before leaving, Jake planted a final message. Using a can of spray paint he'd brought along, he scrawled 3 simple words across one of their tents. I see you. By the time the outlaws discovered his handiwork the next morning, Jake was already back at the farm, preparing for their arrival. Through his drone feed, he watched the chaos unfold. Several of the bikers cursed as they realized their rides were sabotaged. Others stood around the marked tent, their faces pale with unease. Riker was livid. He kicked over a crate and shouted orders, his voice barely audible over the roar of angered men. Jake smirked. The psychological edge was his now. He'd planted a seed of fear, and it was already starting to grow. As the sun rose higher, Jake finalized his defenses. He had a clear view of the road leading to his property, and every step of the way was rigged with surprises. He didn't intend to kill anyone, not unless he had no choice, but he was more than ready to incapacitate and disarm. When the roar of engines finally broke the morning calm, Jake was waiting. Through the scope of an old hunting rifle, he watched as the outlaws approached. There were fewer of them than expected. Clearly, his sabotage had done its job. Still, the ones who came were armed and angry. Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it. The first bike hit a tripwire, sending its rider sprawling into the dirt. 2 more bikes followed, their riders thrown as the hidden spikes punctured their tires. The rest of the group hesitated, their confidence shaken. Riker, at the head of the pack, shouted for them to push forward. He didn't see Jake standing on the porch until it was too late. Jake fired a warning shot, the bullet striking the ground inches from Riker's front wheel. The sound echoed across the valley, freezing the outlaws in their tracks. Turn around, Jake called out, his voice calm but commanding. You've done enough damage. Leave now, and no one else gets hurt. Riker's face twisted in rage. You think you can scare us, old man? He bellowed. Jake didn't respond. Instead, he leveled the rifle, his gaze steady. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Finally, Riker signaled his men to retreat. As they turned their bikes around and roared back down the road, Jake lowered his weapon. For now, the farm was safe. But Jake knew this wasn't over. The outlaws would regroup, and when they returned, they'd bring everything they had. Jake stepped back into his house, his expression grim. The battle was far from finished, but neither was he. The wind howled through the open plains that night, carrying with it an eerie stillness. Jake sat on the porch, his rifle leaning against the railing beside him. The stars above were bright, but Jake's thoughts were dark. He knew the outlaws wouldn't let their humiliation stand. Their retreat was a tactical move, not a surrender. They'd return, and next time they'd bring a fury that only desperation could ignite. Jake ran his fingers over the cold metal of his rifle. He had been careful not to kill anyone earlier, aiming only to send a message. But he knew that restraint might not be an option in the next encounter. He had spent years trying to leave the violence of his past behind, but now it was clawing its way back into his life, forcing him to confront the man he used to be. The next morning, Jake took inventory of his supplies. He had enough food and ammunition to hold out for a while, but the real challenge would be outsmarting the outlaws when they returned. They were angry, but anger could make people sloppy. If Jake could stay a step ahead, he had a chance. In the barn, he worked tirelessly, setting up more traps and fortifying weak points. He reinforced the walls with metal sheets and turned the hayloft into a hidden vantage point. Using a combination of old tools and his ingenuity, he rigged up a series of tripwires and alarms that would alert him to any movement on the property. The barn, once a symbol of peace and hard work, was now a fortress. As the day wore on, Jake's thoughts turned to the town nearby. He had heard the outlaws' plans to raid it, and he couldn't let that happen. The people there were hardworking, honest folk, farmers, shopkeepers, and families who didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. Jake hadn't been to town in months, but now he had no choice. Jake drove his old truck into town as the sun dipped low in the sky. The streets were quiet, the storefronts bathed in the amber glow of evening. He parked outside the sheriff's office, a modest building with peeling paint and a faded sign. Sheriff Harris, a wiry man with a weathered face, looked up from his desk as Jake entered. "Jake Sawyer," Harris said, leaning back in his chair. "Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you into town?" Jake wasted no time. "Trouble," he said. "A gang of outlaws calling themselves the Iron Fangs. They've been on my property and they're planning to hit the town next." Harris frowned, his expression hardening. "We've heard of them. They've been causing problems up north, but we didn't think they'd come this far." "They're here," Jake said firmly. "And they're not just causing trouble. They're armed and organized. You'll need more than a couple of deputies to handle them." Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're stretched thin as it is. The nearest backup is hours away. What do you suggest we do?" Jake hesitated for a moment. He had never been one to ask for help, but this wasn't just about him. "I'll handle my property," he said. "But you need to prepare the town. Warn the people, set up roadblocks, whatever you can do to slow them down." Harris nodded, his respect for Jake evident in his gaze. "We'll do what we can. And Jake, be careful. These guys don't play fair." Back at the farm, the night was darker than usual, the moon obscured by heavy clouds. Jake sat at his kitchen table, cleaning his rifle and going over his plan. He had taken every precaution he could think of, but there was no way to predict the chaos the outlaws would bring. His only advantage was his experience, the years of training and survival that had shaped him into the man he was. As he worked, a soft beeping from his tablet caught his attention. The drone feed showed movement near the outskirts of his property. The outlaws were back, this time in greater numbers. Their bikes moved in a tight formation, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Jake's jaw tightened. It was time. The outlaws hit the first trap just as they reached the edge of the property. A tripwire triggered a flashbang, disorienting the riders and sending two of them tumbling from their bikes. Jake watched from the barn, his rifle trained on the group. He counted at least a dozen men, including Riker, who barked orders and waved his crew forward. The traps worked as intended, slowing the outlaws and forcing them to dismount. Jake picked them off one by one, not with lethal force, but with precision. A shot to the leg here, a shoulder there. Each hit sent a clear message. They were outmatched. But Riker wasn't easily deterred. He rallied his men, leading them toward the barn. Jake retreated to the loft, his vantage point giving him a clear view of their approach. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The battle was far from over, but Jake was ready for whatever came next. The night sky was lit intermittently by flashes of light and the muffled pops of gunfire. Jake had the upper hand, but the outlaws were relentless. From his vantage point in the barn loft, he could see Riker directing his men, their movements frantic as they tried to outmaneuver Jake's defenses. The traps had slowed them, and his precision shooting had thinned their numbers, but the fight wasn't over. As Jake steadied his rifle, movement caught his eye. A figure was circling wide, slipping behind the barn. Jake's instincts flared. Riker was trying to flank him. Setting the rifle aside, Jake moved silently to the back of the loft, peering through the cracks in the wooden boards. Sure enough, Riker was there, creeping along the shadows, a pistol in one hand and a lit Molotov cocktail in the other. Jake's breath slowed as his mind raced. If Riker managed to ignite the barn, it would be over. The barn wasn't just his stronghold, it was the heart of his farm, the place that held the equipment and livestock that kept him alive. He couldn't let it burn. Reaching for his knife, Jake climbed down from the loft with practiced stealth. His boots barely made a sound as they touched the hay-strewn floor. Riker was at the rear entrance now, his focus entirely on the task at hand. He didn't see Jake approach until it was too late. With a sudden, fluid motion, Jake grabbed Riker's wrist, twisting it sharply. The bottle fell, its contents spilling harmlessly onto the dirt. Riker spun, his free hand swinging wildly with the pistol. But Jake was faster. He disarmed him with a single, precise strike, sending the gun skittering across the floor. "You're persistent," Jake growled, pinning Riker against the barn wall. "And you're a damn ghost," Riker spat, his breath labored. Jake tightened his grip. "Why are you here? What do you really want?" Riker's grin returned, though it was tinged with pain. "You think this is just about your farm? You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Then enlighten me." Riker hesitated, but the sharp edge of Jake's knife pressing against his side loosened his tongue. "We're just the front," he admitted. "There's bigger fish pulling the strings. Your farm's just part of a bigger plan. A message to the town, to anyone who thinks they can stand up to us." Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just a territorial dispute or a group of bikers trying to flex their muscles. There was something deeper at play. "Who's pulling the strings?" Jake demanded. Riker laughed bitterly. "You think I'd still be breathing if I knew? I just follow orders, old man." Jake's grip loosened slightly, his mind piecing together the puzzle. The Outlaws weren't acting alone. Someone bigger, someone with resources, was orchestrating this chaos, and Jake's farm was just the first domino. A sudden crash broke the moment. One of the Outlaws had broken through the barn door, his weapon raised. Jake reacted instantly, pulling Riker in front of him as a human shield. The intruder hesitated, giving Jake the opening he needed to disarm him and knock him out cold. Riker took the distraction as an opportunity to escape. He slipped from Jake's grasp and darted into the night, his shadow melting into the chaos outside. Jake cursed under his breath, but didn't chase him. There were bigger problems to deal with. Jake retreated to the loft, grabbing his rifle and reassessing the situation. The remaining Outlaws were scattered, their coordination shattered. But Jake knew they wouldn't retreat for long. Riker's revelation hung heavy in his mind. If the Outlaws were just the tip of the iceberg, then his fight was far from over. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the battle quieted. The surviving Outlaws, battered and humiliated, finally retreated, leaving behind their wounded and broken bikes. Jake didn't celebrate. He knew this was just the beginning. Back in the house, Jake replayed the night's events in his mind. Riker's words echoed like a warning. There was a larger force at work, and Jake's farm had become the center of their plans. But why? What was so important about this patch of land? Opening his box of mementos, Jake retrieved an old map. It was one of the few things he had kept from his time in the Delta Force, a detailed layout of the surrounding area. As he studied it, a realization struck him. His farm sat atop a critical juncture, a forgotten piece of infrastructure that could control access to the valley. Whoever controlled it could dominate the region. Jake clenched his fists. This wasn't just about him anymore. The Outlaws' attack was a prelude to something far more dangerous. If he didn't stop them, the entire valley would suffer. The morning was quiet, but Jake's resolve was anything but. He contacted Sheriff Harris, relaying what he had learned. Harris promised to escalate the situation, but Jake knew it wouldn't be enough. The authorities were too slow, too limited. This was his fight now, and Jake wasn't just defending his farm anymore. He was defending his home, his neighbors, and his way of life. The pale light of dawn crept over the valley, casting long shadows across Jake's farm. The quiet was deceptive, a fragile calm that masked the storm brewing on the horizon. Jake stood in his barn, methodically loading ammunition into his rifle. The events of the night had left their mark, not just on his farm, but on his mind. Riker's revelation was a wake-up call. This fight was no longer about protecting his land. It was about stopping something far bigger than himself. From the loft, Jake scanned the horizon through his scope. He spotted movement in the distance. Vehicles, not just motorcycles, but trucks and SUVs kicking up dust as they roared toward his property. This was it. The Outlaws weren't just regrouping. They were escalating. This time, they weren't taking any chances. Jake's traps were reset, his defenses fortified, and his mind sharpened by years of experience. He wasn't the same man who had quietly tended cattle and repaired fences. That man was gone, replaced by the warrior who had lain dormant for so long. The convoy stopped just short of his property line. Riker emerged first, his leather vest glinting in the sunlight. Behind him, men spilled out of the vehicles, armed with rifles, shotguns, and even improvised explosives. Jake counted at least 20 of them. Riker's sneer was visible even from a distance. "Jake Sawyer!" Riker's voice boomed across the valley. "You've made this personal. And now, we're gonna make you regret it." Jake didn't respond. He watched silently, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He knew better than to waste energy on threats. Words wouldn't stop these men. Action would. Riker signaled his men to advance. They moved cautiously, spreading out to cover more ground. Jake let the first wave past the tripwire before triggering the trap. A deafening explosion sent dirt and debris flying, taking down 2 of the Outlaws and sending the others scrambling for cover. The chaos was immediate. Jake used the moment to pick off the stragglers, his shots precise and calculated. One by one, the Outlaws fell, their arrogance replaced by panic. But Riker wasn't deterred. He rallied his men, pushing them forward with a ferocity born of desperation. The barn became Jake's fortress. He moved seamlessly between vantage points, using his traps and superior positioning to keep the Outlaws at bay. Smoke filled the air as Molotov cocktails ignited sections of the field, but the fire didn't spread fast enough to reach the barn. Jake had anticipated this, clearing the area closest to the structure to minimize the risk. As the battle raged on, Jake noticed a shift in the Outlaws' strategy. A smaller group was circling around to the back of the barn, trying to flank him. Jake adjusted his position, climbing onto the roof for a better angle. From there, he took out 2 more attackers before they could reach the rear entrance. But Riker was still out there, barking orders and refusing to back down. Jake spotted him near one of the trucks, rallying his remaining men. It was clear that Riker was the linchpin. If Jake could take him out, the rest would crumble. Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. His hands were steady as he lined up the shot. But just as he squeezed the trigger, a burst of gunfire forced him to duck. One of the Outlaws had spotted him, pinning him down with a relentless barrage. Jake rolled off the roof, landing in the dirt with a grunt. He scrambled for cover, narrowly avoiding another volley of bullets. The fight was getting closer now. The Outlaws were pushing toward the barn, their numbers dwindling but their determination unshaken. Jake retreated inside, setting up his final line of defense. He had barricaded the doors and windows, leaving only a few narrow openings for firing. Riker's voice echoed outside. "You're done, Sawyer. Come out and face me." Jake's response was a single shot, shattering the windshield of Riker's truck. The message was clear. He wasn't giving up. The standoff reached its climax as Riker and his remaining men stormed the barn. Jake met them head-on, using every ounce of his training to outmaneuver and outfight them. The confined space worked to his advantage, forcing the Outlaws into choke points where he could take them out one by one. Finally, it was just Jake and Riker. The barn was quiet now, the air thick with smoke and tension. Riker stood at the center, his pistol drawn, a twisted grin on his face. "You've put up a good fight, old man," Riker said, circling Jake. "But this ends here." Jake didn't answer. He moved deliberately, his knife in hand, his eyes locked on Riker. The 2 men clashed in a brutal, close-quarters fight. Riker's brute strength was no match for Jake's precision and experience. Within moments, Jake disarmed him, pinning him to the ground. "You don't belong here," Jake growled. "And if you come back, it'll be the last mistake you ever make." Riker glared up at him, his defiance fading into something closer to fear. Jake let him go, watching as the once proud leader scrambled to his feet and fled into the night. As the sun rose higher, the valley was silent once more. The Outlaws were gone, their assault broken, their leader defeated. Jake stood outside the barn, his breath heavy. his body aching but unbroken. He knew this wasn't over. The fight had revealed something bigger, a shadowy force pulling the strings. But for now, his home was safe, and Jake was ready for whatever came next. The morning sun cast long shadows over the battered landscape. The signs of battle were everywhere: charred fields, shattered fences, and the remnants of the traps Jake had set. Yet the silence was almost peaceful. For the first time in days, the roar of engines and the shouts of the outlaws were gone. Jake stood at the edge of his property, surveying the aftermath. His body ached, his hands were raw, and his muscles screamed in protest, but his spirit remained unbroken. Jake's first task was tending to the wounded outlaws who had been left behind. As much as he despised what they had done, he wasn't about to let them die on his land. He dragged the unconscious and injured men into the shade, using his old medical training to stabilize their wounds. One of the younger men, barely out of his teens, looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Why didn't you just leave us out there?" the boy asked, his voice shaky. Jake paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Because you're not my enemy," he said simply. "You made a mistake. Now you've got a choice. Learn from it, or keep running with men like Riker." The boy nodded, tears welling in his eyes. Jake didn't press him further. He had done what he could. The rest was up to them. As the day wore on, Jake returned to the farmhouse. His barn was damaged, but it had held up. The fields were scorched in places, but the fire hadn't spread to his crops. Despite the destruction, his home still stood, a testament to his resilience. He walked through the house, checking for any damage, and paused at the table where his old Delta Force gear was laid out. The tools of his past had saved his present, but they were also a stark reminder of the man he used to be. Jake gathered the gear and placed it back into the box, securing it under the floorboards once more. He didn't want to forget his past, but he wasn't going to let it define him. This was his home, and he would protect it with everything he had. But the farmer in him wasn't ready to give up just yet. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Harris arrived with a small convoy of deputies. The sheriff stepped out of his car, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "Jake," Harris said, walking up to him. "Looks like you've been busy." "You could say that," Jake replied, his tone dry. Harris gestured toward the wounded outlaws. "You didn't have to take care of them, you know. Most people would have left them for dead." Jake shrugged. "I'm not most people." Harris nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "We'll take it from here. And don't worry, we'll make sure Riker and his crew don't bother you again." Jake watched as the deputies loaded the outlaws into their vehicles. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of relief. The immediate threat was over, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to come. As evening fell, Jake sat on his porch, the warmth of a cup of coffee in his hands. The farm was quiet now, the chaos replaced by a tranquil stillness. Yet, his mind wasn't at ease. Riker's words haunted him. The outlaws were just the front line. Someone else was pulling the strings, and whoever it was wouldn't stop with a single defeat. Jake pulled out the old map he had studied the night before. His farm was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a crucial one. The network of roads and resources it controlled made it a strategic point for anyone looking to dominate the valley. Jake realized he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed allies, people who understood what was at stake. The next morning, Jake drove into town. The streets were busier now, the townsfolk going about their day, unaware of how close they had come to danger. Jake parked outside the diner and walked inside. The familiar hum of chatter greeted him, along with the smell of coffee and freshly baked pie. A few heads turned as Jake entered. People had heard about the fight, and the rumors were already spreading. But Jake ignored the stares, heading straight for a booth where Sheriff Harris sat, sipping his coffee. "Harris," Jake said, sliding into the seat across from him. "We need to talk." The sheriff set his cup down, his expression serious. "What's on your mind?" Jake laid the map on the table, pointing to the key locations he had marked. "This wasn't just about my farm. Whoever's behind this is playing a bigger game. They're after control of the valley, and they won't stop until they get it." Harris studied the map, his brow furrowing. "You think they'll come back?" Jake nodded. "I know they will, and when they do, they'll be stronger. We need to be ready." The sheriff leaned back, his eyes scanning the map. "All right," he said finally. What's your plan? Over the next few weeks, Jake and Harris worked together to prepare the town. They organized patrols, fortified key locations, and built a network of communication among the locals. Jake's experience in strategy and tactics proved invaluable, and for the first time, the town felt united. As the community rallied, Jake found himself reconnecting with people he had long kept at a distance. Neighbors who once barely knew him now came to him for advice, offering their own skills and resources in return. Slowly but surely, the farmer and the warrior within Jake found a way to coexist. By the time the first snowfall blanketed the valley, the farm and the town were stronger than ever. Jake stood on his porch, watching as the flakes drifted down, covering the scars of the battle like a fresh start. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for now, peace had returned, and Jake was ready for whatever came next. Winter descended upon the valley, blanketing the landscape in a pristine layer of snow. The scars of the battle were hidden beneath nature's quiet embrace. But for Jake Sawyer, the fight was far from forgotten. He stood on his porch, sipping a steaming mug of coffee, his eyes scanning the horizon. The stillness of the morning was deceptive. He knew the shadows that loomed beyond the borders of his farm were merely regrouping, waiting for their next move. Jake had spent the weeks since the Outlaws' retreat strengthening not just his farm, but the entire community. Sheriff Harris had proven to be a reliable ally, rallying the townsfolk to prepare for future threats. The once fragmented valley now operated as a unified force, a network of neighbors bound by a shared determination to protect their home. The diner became an unofficial meeting place for strategy sessions. Farmers, shopkeepers, and even retired veterans gathered around tables, sharing information and resources. Jake's map, now filled with additional marks and notes, was pinned to the wall behind the counter, a testament to the town's resilience. "You've done a lot for us, Jake," Harris said one evening as they reviewed patrol schedules. "But you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. We've got your back." Jake nodded, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a bit lighter. "I appreciate that," he replied. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. If we don't stand together, we'll fall apart." The sheriff raised his coffee mug in a silent toast, and Jake returned the gesture. One snowy morning, Jake received an unexpected visitor. The young outlaw he had tended to after the battle appeared at the edge of his property, bundled in a worn jacket, his breath visible in the icy air. Jake watched from the porch as the boy approached, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Thought you might shoot me on sight," the boy said with a nervous chuckle. "Depends on why you're here," Jake replied, his tone even but not unkind. The boy hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "You didn't have to help me, but you did. And I've been thinking about what you said, about choices." Jake unfolded the paper, revealing a hastily written list of names and locations. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the page. "It's everything I know about the people behind the Outlaws," the boy explained. "They're not just after you. They've got plans for the whole valley, and beyond." Jake looked up, his gaze piercing. "Why are you giving me this?" The boy shuffled his feet, his breath puffing in the cold. "Because I want to be better than them, and maybe if I help you, I can start over." Jake nodded slowly, tucking the paper into his jacket. "You've made the right choice," he said. "But this is just the beginning. If you're serious about changing, it's going to take work." The boy straightened, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I'm ready," he said. The information the boy provided proved invaluable. It confirmed Jake's suspicions. The Outlaws were just a small piece of a larger operation, one that involved smuggling, extortion, and a network of corrupt individuals spread across the region. The valley's strategic location made it a key target, and Jake's farm had been the first test. Jake shared the intel with Harris, and together they coordinated with neighboring towns to dismantle the operation piece by piece. The boy who had once ridden with the Outlaws became a quiet ally, helping to decode the group's movements and strategies. His insight saved lives and prevented more attacks, earning him a place among the community he had once threatened. As the weeks turned into months, the valley began to heal. The battle scars faded, and the people grew stronger, more connected. Jake's farm became a symbol of resilience, a place where neighbors gathered not just to plan, but to celebrate small victories. One evening, As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, the townsfolk organized a gathering at the diner. Jake was reluctant to go, but Harris insisted. "You've done more for this valley than anyone," the sheriff said. "It's time you let people thank you." The diner was packed when Jake arrived, the hum of conversation filling the air. A cheer erupted as he stepped inside, and for a moment he was overwhelmed. He had always preferred solitude, but here, surrounded by people who had become like family, he felt something he hadn't in years: belonging. Harris raised a toast. "To Jake Sawyer," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "The man who reminded us all what it means to fight for what's right." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Jake, though unaccustomed to the attention, managed a small smile. As the gathering wound down, Jake stepped outside, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth inside. He looked up at the stars, feeling a quiet sense of peace. The fight wasn't over. Not entirely, but for the first time, he felt ready for whatever came next. The sound of footsteps behind him drew his attention. The boy from the Outlaws stood there, his hands in his pockets. "Thanks for giving me a chance," the boy said. Jake nodded. "Just make sure you earn it." The boy smiled and walked away, leaving Jake alone under the vast Montana sky. Jake turned back toward the diner, the voices of his neighbors still carrying through the open door. He had spent years running from his past, but now, he realized, he didn't have to. This valley was his home, and these people were his family, and no matter what came next, Jake Sawyer was ready to stand his ground. Jake Sawyer's journey from a quiet farmer to a protector of his community reminds us all of the power of resilience, courage, and the strength to stand up against adversity. His farm, once a symbol of solitude, became the heart of a united valley, a testament to the idea that even the most unassuming individuals can make a monumental impact. As the stars shine over the Montana sky, Jake's story leaves us with a powerful message. True strength isn't just about fighting battles. It's about finding purpose, forging connections, and protecting what matters most. If Jake's story of courage and resilience inspired you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to never miss another incredible tale. Share this story with someone who loves narratives about bravery, justice, and redemption. And let us know in the comments, what would you do to protect the ones you love? Join the conversation and be part of the community.